Greetings, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you're joining us from. Welcome to the first of the Missing Lecture Series. It is organized by InSAF India and India Civil Watch International. InSAF, which means justice in Urdu Hindi, is an acronym for International Solidarity for Academic Freedom in India. We are a group of diasporic Indians located in different parts of the world, currently mainly Europe and North America. Some of us are academics, some are professionals in various fields. We all share a deep concern about the increasing assaults on academic freedom in India, in particular, the attacks on anti-caste academics and scholars from minority backgrounds. These attacks are occurring in the context of a deepening authoritarianism in society as a whole that has accompanied neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is not new with the current government, but it has become even more radicalized since Modi was elected in 2014. So usually the inauguration of a new series of lectures in academia is a cause for celebration. This is the exact opposite of how we feel today. We wish we did not have to have a series called Missing Lectures. We wish this would be the first and last of it. We're holding these series because we have to, because there is no alternative if we want to push back at the rapid escalation of assaults on academics, scholars, and activists who dare to question the current regime and its ongoing drive to privatize every aspect of life, or call it monetize, or whatever they call it. Dozens of Indian academics, students, public intellectuals, and civil liberties activists have been arrested on outrageous charges of sedition and kept in prison for years without trial. Many have been active as educators in raising awareness about the damage done by developmental and corporate-friendly policies to rural communities and the urban poor, Dalit and Adivasi communities. We're still grieving the death of Father Stan Swami, a Jesuit priest who spent his life working with indigenous people, who died in prison at the age of 83, accused as a terrorist without medical bail and with no date set for trial. He was an academic too. He had served as the director of the Indian Social Institute, Bangalore, for 15 years. So the attacks on academia are happening then within this context. Nandini Sundar and Gauhar Fazli have compiled a report, and we can share it in the chat box, that chart 6 main areas of the stifling of academics, besides the straightforward just putting people in prison without trial. So these are censorship of books and interference with university syllabi, including sometimes objecting to the author, not even the content, denial of permission, disruption of seminars, meetings, events on campus, actual physical attacks on faculty and students, minorities, especially Muslims and Dalits and women, are particularly targeted, termination, suspension, resignation of faculty and suspension of students, suspension of faculty, denial of research visas, and restrictions on academic exchanges. Just this past year, there was a memo that for international speakers to speak in online webinars held by universities in India, they would have to be vetted by the Ministry for External Affairs. The memo was revoked formally, but informally, that sort of censorship continues. And it is in this context that we're gathered here for the first of the Missing Lectures. My name is Jyotsna Kapoor, and I'm a professor of cinema and media studies and director of the University Honors Program at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. It is my honor to introduce you to Dr. Deepa Kumar, professor in the Department of Journalism and Media Studies at Rutgers University. She is the recipient of the Dallas Smythe Award, the Georgina Smith Award for her work, and the Georgina Smith Award for her work on gender and race equality. The Dallas Smythe Award is for her engaged scholarship, And she's also the recipient of the Marilyn Sternberg Award for her leadership of the Rutgers AAUP AFT Faculty Union. She's the author of more than 75 publications, including books, journal articles, book chapters, and articles in independent and mainstream media. She's recognized as a leading scholar on Islamophobia, both nationally and internationally. Her book on Islamophobia has been translated into 5 languages, and it is the second edition that we're talking about here today. In May 2021, Professor Deepa Kumar was due to record a TED Talk on Islamophobia for the students of the Manipal Academy of Higher Education, MAHE, Manipal, India. The recording was to be played on 30th May, followed by discussion and Q&A with the speaker. The talk was organized by students following the guidelines set by TEDx. However, as soon as the talk was advertised, a Hindu right-wing campaign was launched, vilifying Dr. Kumar and insisting that the invitation be withdrawn. Within 24 hours, the Vice Chancellor of MAHE, who is known to be a keen supporter of India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, cancelled the talk. Now, the Vice Chancellor and many others have been given copies of her book, yet they chose not to give any explanation for cancelling the talk. What remained in social media, on the other hand, was a vicious hate campaign against Dr. Kumar, characterizing her as a terrorist for participating in a panel in the World Social Forum, along with participants speaking on Palestine, Kashmir, and Iraq. And this had happened in 2004. So that panel was pulled up in 2021. At the very least, we feel what may have been an opportunity to engage in discussion and exchange of ideas, which is what universities are supposed to do. The discussion was simply shut down in an absolutely authoritarian manner. Thus, Manipal University became just another microcosm of what is now the norm, the rule of the mob, given impunity by those at the top. It creates an atmosphere of fear, mistrust, and a radical form of isolation that tears democracy and our society apart. But people resist. Anand Gopal from prison is writing on, continues to write. Omar Khalid, who finishes his first year in jail today, has a review out today on a graphic novel on the Shaheen Bagh protest. And so in that context, we're doing our own small part and created this series called Missing Lectures. It's a forum where the lectures that have been canceled will be heard and given, and discussion will take place. So Deepa, welcome. Deepa will give her talk for about 20 minutes. Then we will have Q&A. Please post your questions in the Q&A, and in the spirit of discussion and debate, keep your comments polite, use reason and argument and evidence. So at this point, Deepa, I'm going to invite you to take the floor. And thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Jyotsna, for that kind introduction, for laying out that context, and a huge thanks to InSAF India for taking up the mantle of academic freedom and creating this series so that a diversity and plurality of views can actually be heard by students and by citizens and by residents of India. So the talk I was going to give, I'm going to pretty much give the same talk now. I've just changed about 2 or 3 sentences and not done very much more. And I leave it to you to determine exactly what makes this, threatening and why this talk should have been censored. It is alarming that this happened. For me, it was a wake-up call of the kind of atmosphere that has been created by Hindu supremacists in India, and very saddening to see that the educational experience that I had growing up in India, growing up in Bangalore, where debate and disagreement was the order of the day, is not something that is tolerated anymore. So with that, I will start my presentation as I was going to on May 30th. I want to begin with an incident that took place on September 11th, 2001, since it taught me a lot about how race functions. On the afternoon of that fateful day, I was at a grocery store and was struck by how angry the checkout clerk appeared to be. After ringing up several of my purchases, he couldn't contain himself anymore and came flat out and asked me to apologize for what had happened earlier in the day. I was shocked. I didn't know how to reply. I couldn't think of any conceivable way in which I was connected to the attacks on the Twin Towers. And while I pondered the strange position that I was put in, what I knew beyond a shadow of doubt was when I could finally find the words to express myself, I would not reveal that I was neither Muslim nor Arab. To me, this is a basic principle of solidarity. When you dehumanize another, you dehumanize yourself. When the words finally came back to me, I asked him if he had heard of Timothy McVeigh and the attack that he carried out in Oklahoma City. I asked him if he thought that all white people and all Christians were responsible. He didn't reply. I learned two things that day. First, I look Muslim. And second, for a white checkout clerk, everyone who looks a certain way are a race of people, a collective where one person can stand in for the other. While whites are seen as individuals, as unique, so that apologizing for McVeigh's actions seemed ludicrous to him, the same logic did not apply to me. I was interchangeable with Osama bin Laden. This incident taught me how races are socially produced. This young man, no doubt, was drawing his cues from political and media personalities and had created a world in which white people were the victims of 9/11, never mind that the people who died on that fateful day were multiracial and from around the world, and that brown people and Muslim-looking people were the villains. So in my presentation today, I'm going to explain what anti-Muslim racism is, how it works, and where it comes from. I will argue that Islamophobia is best understood as anti-Muslim racism rather than as religious intolerance or as misunderstanding. So let me start by clarifying that there is no such thing as race. That is, there is no biological basis for race, as numerous scholars have established over the last 50 years. Races are artificial constructs that are produced in arbitrary ways, taking markers such as skin color, hair texture, eye shape, or cultural markers such as religious clothing as ways to divide human beings. To see the absurdity of this, imagine if we divided all human beings into a short race, which, let us say, included everyone under 5'5", and a tall race with everyone who was above that height. Certainly, there is a visible difference between those who are short and those who are tall, just as there are differences in skin color. But to then make generalizations about all short or all tall people would strike most of us as patently absurd. For instance, to say that tall people take up more space and therefore are more selfish would immediately seem silly. Imagine if we went around saying that all tall people are greedy and all short people are stupid. We would be laughed at. Yet races created on the basis of skin color, religion, or culture appear natural and are taken for granted. This is what makes it possible to say that all Muslims are X or all Muslims are Y. If we dig a little deeper, what we find is that races are socially constructed and serve to bolster unjust social, economic, and political projects. So for instance, to justify slavery and the super exploitation of enslaved Black people, colonial America created them as an inferior race of people not worthy of rights. They were legally classified as chattel or as property rather than as full human beings. To justify the expropriation of Native American lands, the indigenous population was produced as an inferior, savage race. They were not only subject to genocide, but their history was erased as well. We see the same process at work in all settler colonial societies. After the Nakba of 1948, or the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians and the occupation of their lands, the Israeli government replaced the Arab names for Palestinian cities and villages with Hebrew names. It is only through erasure of the sort and dehumanization that settler colonial projects can succeed. Similarly, in the context of European colonization and conquest of Muslim and Arab and South Asian lands, that it was possible to produce all these people as a race. The British writer Rudyard Kipling, who incidentally was born in India, characterized the colonized as half devil, half child. And you see in this formulation an understanding of the Oriental as less than, as inferior to the British. Thus it was, as Kipling put it, the white man's burden to civilize the benighted masses. Now, after 9/11, the US passed the authorization for the use of military force, which allowed it to wage an endless and unbounded war on terror on a planetary basis. This is a political and economic project to assert US global hegemony with Islamophobia as its handmaiden. Just between 2018 and 2020, the United States conducted counterterrorism operations in 85 countries around the world. It also expanded to somewhere between 800 and 1,000 the number of military bases it has around the world. This is how an empire builds its power. And all this is justified through racism, fear, and paranoia. I use the word paranoia deliberately because numerous scholars and counterterrorism experts have demonstrated that the threat from jihadist forces has been blown way out of proportion. One study conducted by a former CIA officer shows that in the 10 years since 9/11, less than 1 in 1 million Muslims in the West were involved per year in either a terrorist plot or an actual attack. And yet, we are asked to believe that Islam is inherently violent and that Muslims are ticking time bombs waiting to explode into violent rage. This is what justifies intrusive surveillance as well as drone strikes. And this is also how racism works. Unsubstantiated claims are generalized to whole groups of people. While it is true that Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Al-Shabaab, and so on have carried out deadly attacks, to then paint all Muslims with the same brush is race talk. It is race making. We would not, for instance, say that all white men need to be monitored, surveilled, and interrogated because of the attacks carried out by Anders Breivik of Norway, Brenton Tarrant of New Zealand, or Wade Michael Page of the United States. We would not blame all Chinese people for the persecution of the Uyghur Muslims in the Xinjiang province. We would not blame all Hindus for the anti-Muslim pogroms in Gujarat in 2002, which left thousands of Indian Muslims dead and tens of thousands homeless. And we would not collectively hold Hindus responsible for the atrocities that the Indian military has committed in Muslim-majority Kashmir. We would not blame all Jews for the actions of the Israeli government and its attacks on Palestinian people. In each of these cases, we make a distinction between an individual and a state entity that is driven by a particular project and the mass of people who share with them a nationality, ethnicity, religion, or skin color. We differentiate between individuals and entities. When we fail to make that distinction, we are involved in the production of races. When the acts of 19 men become associated with all Muslims and those who look Muslim, what we see at work is a process called racialization. This process is one where whole groups of people are turned into a race, and in the case of Muslims, a threatening and dangerous race that must be surveilled, jailed, tortured, expelled, or killed. So did anti-Muslim racism begin after 9/11? No, it has a much longer history. As I noted earlier, anti-Muslim racism was developed as a full-blown project in the 19th century in the context of European colonization of much of the world. There are those who have argued that Islamophobia goes back all the way to the Crusades and begins in the 11th century. I take issue with this argument not because anti-Muslim hatred and prejudice didn't exist during the Crusades, but because the modern notion of race did not exist in the Middle Ages. Certainly, there are many tropes that are part of anti-Muslim racism that go back to the Crusades, such as the notion that Islam is violent or that Muslims are sexual deviants. But the idea that they were a race that were completely different and furthermore inferior to Europeans did not exist in the way that it does today. This is because of two reasons. First, from the 8th to the 18th centuries, powerful Muslim empires stretched the globe from the Atlantic to the Pacific. In this context, it was hard to create an inferior Muslim race. The notion of inferiority, by the way, is central to the modern notion of race. Keep in mind that until 1500 or so, Western Europe, with its various feudal kingdoms, was a marginal player on the world stage relative to other great powers, such as the Ottomans, the Chinese, and the Indians. The Ottomans ruled a large swath of land, and the Mughals in South Asia were a powerful and advanced force from the early 16th to the 18th centuries. Through much of the Middle Ages and the early modern era, the accomplishments of the Muslim empires were admired, even if this was mixed with fear or contempt. Thus, while the Ottomans were seen as threats, they were nonetheless accepted as Europeans and not seen as other in many European nations. This was particularly true of England. In fact, as late as the 18th century, English scholar Samuel Johnson noted that, quote, "There are two objects of curiosity, the Christian world and the Mohammedan world. All the rest may be considered barbarous." In this context, it was not possible to develop a uniform notion of Muslims as inferior, which is a hallmark of modern racism. Second, Christianity informed the thinking of Europeans in the Middle Ages, and Christianity allows for conversion. Thus, even if one was seen as an enemy, as was the Muslim, if the Muslim converted to Christianity, they would be accepted. Christian universalism did not allow for the creation of permanent others. This changed, however, in the early modern era when conversion to Christianity did not guarantee acceptance, as we see in the case of Spain and Portugal, which emerged as the key imperial powers in the era of mercantile imperialism. Spain expelled its Jewish population in the late 15th century and began a similar process with Muslims expelling them in the early 17th century. They introduced blood purity laws that stated that even if a person converted to Christianity, their blood was still impure. This incipient notion of race rooted in the body was developed further during the Enlightenment, which is the scientific and philosophical movement in Europe of the 17th and 18th centuries. Science replaced religion as the means through which othering was mobilized. The shift from religious to scientific modes of thought and analysis, while initiated in the Renaissance period, underwent a significant deepening in the 18th century. This informed the development of scientific racism as an ideology to justify most immediately slavery and conquest. This is the context then for the birth of Orientalism, a body of knowledge and a mode of governance that informed particularly British and French colonization of the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia. Institutional Orientalism created the colonized as an inferior race, When Kipling wrote his poem, White Man's Burden, he was simply reflecting a notion of the superior white race in contrast to inferior Arabs, South Asians, Muslims, and Persians. So I want to show you an image for an ad that appeared around the time. This is an ad for Pear Soap. Let me pull that up. Can you see it? Okay, so what you see here really is the white man's burden being mobilized to sell Pear Soap, right? So this idea was so common that in fact it made its way into consumer culture in order to justify colonialism and imperialism. So let me get out of this. Now, the idea, of course, is cleanliness is associated with Britain, and its burden was to clean up the unwashed colonial masses. And I'm going to show you another image of how pears can even apparently wash away blackness. And it's an image of a white baby cleaning a black baby in, again, the same kind of colonial logic. I'll leave that on for a few minutes for you to absorb. Pears turning a black baby into a white baby, but you'll notice that his face still remains dark, and that's the civilizing mission. You can change them, but only up to a certain point, and this is why it is important to civilize, colonize, and continue to maintain colonial domination. Now, this trope, another dimension of Orientalism is how women were constructed. It's known as colonial feminism, if you will. And I want to show you an image of a painting by the Orientalist painter Eugene Delacroix. It's called Death of Sardanapalus. The painting is a vivid depiction of cruelty and torture, where women are in various stages of being killed. You will see that there is a woman lying on the bed, while the ruler Sardanapalus looks on as if the torture of women were a normal, mundane act. Now, those who saw this painting in Europe would have been horrified at the treatment of women in the East, and it would have bolstered the argument of rescuing these women from their men. I'll leave it for a few minutes for you to see. Here you see the Oriental despot, which is how this language evolved, the woman lying possibly dead, while others, including the animal, are being tortured and in various stages of being killed. Now, this trope of the West rescuing brown women from brown men continues into the 21st century. One of the reasons that the US gave for going to war in Afghanistan was to rescue or liberate Afghan women. As President George Bush's wife, Laura Bush, put it, quote, "Fighting brutality against women and children is not the expression of a specific culture. It is the acceptance of our common humanity, a commitment shared by people of goodwill on every continent. This is a fight against terrorism. The fight against terrorism is also a fight for the rights and dignity of women." And so you see how the war on terror draws on these earlier Orientalist arguments. The reality, of course, as various human rights activists and advocates have pointed out, the situation for women in Afghanistan was made unbearable particularly for the vast majority who live in the rural areas. So if half devil, half child characterized the attitude towards the colonized in the 19th century, today we may say half terrorist, half victim characterizes how Muslims are racialized, with men typically coded as terrorists and women as victims. So what I've tried to show is that anti-Muslim racism is not new, but has a longer history that is rooted in imperial projects. Today, the war on terror has amplified Islamophobia on the global stage so that even smaller countries like Myanmar can get away with ethnically cleansing their Muslim Rohingya population. The Muslim has become a figure against whom atrocities can be justified on a global scale. And I'll come to a close with this. If we understand that races are socially constructed to justify and facilitate larger agendas, then it becomes possible to think critically about statements and policies that pass as common sense, that parade as the truth. We can reject the notion that all Muslims are violent or misogynistic or undemocratic and begin a process of thinking of our Muslim sisters and brothers as full human beings. In the end, when we deny another's humanity, we deny our own. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deepa. So I would just like to open it up to Q&A. But, as you were talking about this kind of the process of racialization and the global hegemony of Islamophobia that justified the so-called war on terror or the terror war of the United States and came to be adopted by other countries. It became the norm. Islamophobia becomes the norm for hegemony, for capitalist accumulation, for suppression of people. But the way it does is it seeps into our very psyche through tropes like paranoia, through these kind of gendered ideas that Muslim men are terrorists and Muslim women need saving. I remember Laura Bush even saying that Afghani women needed to put on nail polish. I don't want to hog the space, but there's an anecdote I'd like to share here. So like you shared your anecdote about the grocer. So after 9/11, in my small town, the local mosque was defaced. And on it were put slogans like Free Kashmir. The Om sign was put on it. So in the morning, when the imam, who's African-American, and most of the people going to the mosque are either from the Middle East or African-American, very few, from India or Pakistan or, Bangladesh, they were like, the imam is saying, what is this Free Kashmir? What Kashmir? But I think it taught me that lesson as well, that this is where, this kind of Hindutva forces feel empowered. That, okay, we've been fighting this kind of, we've been raising the alarms about Muslims, and now you see what it is like. So there is a kind of circular loop that is happening.
Yes, and alarmingly, Jyotsna, as we learned at the Dismantling Global Hindutva Conference, is that there are so many alliances between white supremacists in the US, the far right in the US, and Hindu supremacists in India, including the presence of the Indian flag at the January 6th riot at the Capitol. And so there's, these forces of reaction and hate are making common cause across the globe.
Right. And Islamophobia in the Indian context has to do with the caste system. Well, people convert out of Hinduism to escape the atrocities of casteism. So I think your I mean, you started with this question about like why they would have canceled this talk. It's like to even talk about Islamophobia today is to be taking on a global hegemon, and these local, hegemons aspiring for that. You had raised this at the conference, and I wonder if you would talk a little more about it. You talked about internationalism and the necessity for international solidarity. So if you could talk a little about that, elaborate on that.
Sure. So the conference really raised a lot of awareness about the ways in which Hindutva is a political ideology that appropriates aspects of Hinduism in a way that advances a reactionary agenda. And what I found fascinating is how various progressive concepts have been appropriated by Hindu supremacists, such as decolonizing the curriculum, right? This is something that many of us would support, but in the name of decolonizing the curriculum, they are rewriting Indian history in line with that particular agenda. Similarly, the notion of Hinduphobia. This is a bogus term. They are trying to parallel, the term Islamophobia and to silence critics of, Hindu supremacy by saying that somehow one is racist if one criticizes a political ideology. And so the point that I made, this is not to say that Indians, South Asians who live in the US, who live in Europe, don't face discrimination or racism. They absolutely do. But the basis of that racism is not their religion. It is not Hinduism in the way that a narrative of Islam as dangerous, as threatening, and so on, that simply does not exist in the West. So I don't want to say that South Asians don't face, racism and discrimination. So all that is the preface to say that early in the 20th century, many people who were progressives and on the left were won to the idea that nationalism in colonized countries should be supported, even though it's not an internationalist project, right? Even though it's about uniting a group of people into this artificial entity known as the nation. And that's because it was important to throw off the yoke of colonialism and colonial power and to actually free people to have self-determination. Unfortunately, the nationalisms of today, particularly Hindu nationalism, is a reactionary and regressive nationalism. It draws from the legacy of the independence movement in India, of the self-determination movement in India, as a way to code itself as somehow being anti-West, as somehow standing up for the rights of, South Asians, Indians in particular, although Hindus, if we want to be honest. And that has confused a lot of people. And this should be rejected. This should absolutely be rejected because this whole philosophy is based on deep casteism, which is anti-Dalit and, anti-Advocacy. And it is deeply racist against religious minorities, and particularly Muslims, who make up more than 200 million of India's population. And so the way in which to combat, I would argue, global Hindutva, which is actually surprisingly resilient in its ability to attract members of the diaspora in the West, which as scholars at the conference pointed out, it's because people want a sense of community, right? You come to the United States, you're so isolated, and you want to be with your people. And into those spaces of belonging, of affection, of love, of solidarity and support, these forces have put their ideas in and therefore mobilized, otherwise good people to taking up the Hindutva mantle. And I know some people who have sent me petitions to protest this or that, and I have to patiently, and I know that they're not racist, but I have to patiently explain, well, do you really want to do this? This is not actually anti-Hindu, it's this, it's that, and so forth. So all this is a long way to say that internationalism really is the way to combat global Hindutva, because we have to align not only with the oppressed minorities in India, but the South Asian community really has a lot of work to do in terms of its own attitude towards racialized groups in the US and in Europe, and to build solidarity with, for instance, the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, and orchestrate and articulate itself in these international terms. I don't agree with using the Indian flag for other purposes, co-opting the Indian flag, taking it away from the symbols that the Hindutva forces, ascribe to it, because they are far more, powerful. They have more resources, and we can't, we really can't push back on their terrain. And I think we need a different politics of resistance. And one that's also anti-sexist, because the Hindutva project is quite patriarchal.
Mm-hmm. Right. No, thank you for that. I think this whole process of racialization that you're tracing, that you actually talk about in your book, the ways in which race talk starts to occur, and we are part of that process. So there's a question here from Ajay Dundee, and he's asking, how is race different from the Hindu caste system in India?
I'll answer that very briefly, because I'm not a scholar or an expert on the Hindu caste system. I understand that Ambedkar argued that caste and race are two different things. But keep in mind that at the time that Dr. Ambedkar was writing, the idea of race was believed to be something that actually exists, right? That people do belong to races. And it's only in the last 50 years, with the research on the Human Genome Project and various kinds of scientific explorations into this topic, that we've come to understand that race is a social construct. So to me, the caste system really is a system of racialization, particularly of the lower caste, because it's about inferiorizing, right, a group of people and justifying their status as these second-class people who should occupy only a particular kind of role and no other. And it's about creating a superior, group of people, the upper caste people. So that's my read. But again, there are people who are far better suited to answer that question in more depth.
Mm-hmm. Great. The next question's from Meena Dhanda. In your assessment, Deepa, why was your lecture cancelled? Had you shared the text in advance, which I think you did? Was it because of the title, or was it that your reputation preceded you and you were seen as dangerous? So are there like dangerous authors as well as dangerous texts?
Absolutely. The title of the talk is Islamophobia is Anti-Muslim Racism. And I think that title was probably seen as threatening. That is, the denial of Islamophobia is something that the ruling elite, particularly in India, the Hindu supremacist forces kind of rely on. So someone who can provide students with the terms, with the concepts to be able to then apply to the Indian context, something that, they didn't want to see actually happen, to foster critical thinking, to give people the tools they need to make their own analysis. I did share the text in advance. The entire speech was vetted by the TEDx team. It was sent to the Vice Chancellor and so forth. and obviously, decided that it was not something that should go ahead. Was it the reputation? I'm sure about it, although I don't know if I have any sort of reputation in India, honestly, because I have not studied India in any systematic way. I don't know if people even know me in the Indian context, but certainly in the US, I have been listed as a dangerous intellectual, and I'm in the company of some incredible scholars who have also been listed as such. And so I'm not sure, I'm not sure I'm such a big figure in the Indian context that I'm dangerous.
There's a remarkable affinity between nationalists, the Hindu nationalists, and US imperialism in that case, right? Like, while they're asserting their independence and the greatness of the nation, they're actually, the dangerous writers and authors are the same. So that tells us something. The next question is from Usha Iyer. She asks, in Rafia Zakaria's Against White Feminism, she frames the war on terror as a feminist war, one of white savior feminists. What Faisal Devji has also discussed is the violence of humanitarianism. What are your thoughts on white women's historical relationship to Islamophobia?
Thank you so much for that question, Usha. So I go through some of the history of colonial feminism or imperial feminism, which actually begins in the 19th century. I go through, that is, the literature on that subject in my book, Islamophobia and the Politics of Empire. A lot of people have written about this. Leela Ahmed actually sort of pioneered the discourse of the veil, and how that became central to British occupation and colonization of Egypt. And so she writes, for instance, about how the overseer of the British occupation, Lord Cromer, would deride Islam in the worst terms. He would say Islam is a canker, it's eaten away at the soul of Egyptian society, and that he was this great champion of women's rights, and that Britain was there to rescue Egyptian women. Never mind, of course, that Cromer was the founding member and president of the Men's League to End Women's Suffrage. And this brings me then to the work that Antoinette Burton and others have done to show, Indrapal Grewal and others, to show how the suffrage movement in Britain actually allied itself with British imperialism, right? That is, the arguments that were made by suffragettes were, if Britain is truly going to be great on the world stage and truly take up the mantle of the white man's burden, then it's got to allow women the right to vote and to be partners in the colonial project, right? So there is a long history of this kind of, complicity between white feminism. I wouldn't say white feminism, I would say white elite, middle and upper class feminism, and the vision that they share versus that of working class women and so forth. The same is true in the US. There's a long history there as well, but this was revived, of course, in the post 9/11 moment with people like Laura Bush, the quote I read out, Sherry Blair and others. But unfortunately, the feminist majority, which is a group that had done some good work in Afghanistan, also jumped on the bandwagon. I had my book launch this past Friday, and Jaspir Puar, who you might know has written about the concept of homo nationalism, she was the moderator, and she began the session by saying how after 9/11 and in the context of the US invasion of Afghanistan, women's studies departments across the US actually were pro-war on terror. Because, as you pointed out, this was the feminist war, right? So it's the weaponization of feminism through a very racist articulation of, the lack of agency of brown women, as Gayatri Spivak put it, right? That white men need to rescue brown women from brown men. And yet here it was back again in the 21st century, and even people who should know better, sort of bought this line hook, line, and sinker. Last thing I'll say about this question is, I don't know if people in India have access to the New Yorker, but I would strongly recommend a piece by the award-winning journalist Anand Gopal. He's an incredible journalist and an amazing writer, but he has a piece which is from the point of view of Afghan women in the countryside about their so-called liberation. And it's really brilliant. He speaks to numerous women in the countryside, and he tells the story of what they've gone through, how the US basically threw them from the frying pan into the fire by propping up these misogynistic warlords who then made their life miserable. Why the Taliban brought peace, and even though they didn't necessarily like some of the things that the Taliban was doing, they tolerated them, and then they thought, oh my gosh, maybe the US would make our lives better. But no, the US has been responsible for so much death and destruction that in the end, people who normally would not have joined the Taliban, their brothers, their fathers, their uncles, actually saw them as the only force after family members were killed and livelihoods destroyed. They saw them as the only force that was capable of getting rid of the US. So it's a pretty excellent article laying out some of this history over the last 20 years. So I'll stop there.
Hey, the next question, if I'm understanding this question fully, is about you and me, South Asian non-Muslim women talking about Islamophobia. So the question reads, how does one talk about taking up space and representation for allyship when the narrative of anti-Muslim racism is relayed by non-Muslims on a larger global space, not necessarily a white person? Where do you draw the line then with respect to creating the modern subaltern? Now, I don't get the last part, but Deepa, maybe you do, but the previous, at least the one that I understand about, questioning us, we don't have, for example, neither of us is a Muslim.
Right. So I'll answer that in a couple of ways. First, in the second edition of my Islamophobia, well, let me say a little bit about the first edition. The first edition of my book was published in 2012. It was the product of my work in the anti-war movement, working with Muslim groups in solidarity in order to push back against what was happening to Muslims in this country as well as around the world. So we would, organize, for instance, not just protests and rallies and so on to stop the war in Iraq, but also to bring attention to how Muslim families were being disappeared, right? Thrown into jail, no access to a lawyer, their families, and just sort of disappeared, deported and so forth. So that book really came out of my activism in solidarity with groups on the front lines, trying to fight back and trying to, give a voice to those who are being invisibilized in this way. The second edition, so this field of Islamophobia studies really sort of came into its own in 2010, 2012, in that range. You see a burst of, articles and books and so forth, and mine was among the first in that wave. And I set out to correct an error that I made in the first book. I mean, there are many errors, really of omission, not of commission. And one of these errors was that I did not elevate the voices of Arab, Muslim, and South Asian scholars enough, because, this was written to make an intervention within the anti-war movement. And I wasn't thinking academically, whose voices should I raise up and so on. And so I've corrected that by including a number of scholars who've been writing about this for a while, by incorporating their voices. But ultimately, I think that a minority in the US, Muslims are, whichever poll you look at, are somewhere between I don't know, 1 and 2% of the US population. And if we leave the fight against anti-Muslim racism to an already vilified group of people who are a minority in the US and don't stand up and raise our voices and stand in solidarity, we have very little chance really of fighting this very pernicious form of racism. So it's a question really of solidarity and thinking through what our responsibility is in this context. I may not be Muslim, but I've certainly been treated like I'm Muslim. So there is that grounds for solidarity. But then again, I'm also part of, all sorts of other movements, such as against police violence directed primarily at Black and Latinx people. And honestly, I don't think that one has to experience a form of racism to fight it. And that if we are principled anti-racists, we should be standing up and standing in solidarity with everyone who is affected by a form of racism.
Thank you for that really powerful and comprehensive answer. Yes, the task of fighting Islamophobia cannot be just left to a small minority already targeted, already with an embattled on its back. Yes, and embattled. The next question is from Arana Khan, and the question is, I think about conflating religion and race. So the question is, don't you think one has to tread carefully here, because religion is so wrapped up in identity, particularly for the diaspora? There has been so much debate about delinking Hinduism from Hindutva, much in the same way as most Muslims feel about being clubbed with radicals whenever the term Islamic fundamentalism is used. So what would this mean in terms of tackling extremism, nationalism amongst Hindus? I'm thinking that Rana, when she said, what does this mean, is thinking about Islamophobia as racialization.
No, this is an excellent question, Rana. Thank you very much. And you're absolutely right that, people do want to de-link Hinduism from Hindutva, Islam from Islamic fundamentalism, and for very good reasons, because it's not the Hinduism that they practice, it is not the Islam that they practice, and so forth. But I'll just speak to this in this way, which is that it depends on who you're talking to, it depends on the audience that, that you're addressing. And so if, communities that I know in New Jersey, Indian Hindu communities that invite me to things and so forth, I know these people are fundamentally great people. And indeed, their identity is wrapped up in their religion. And so when, they ask me to lend my voice to certain things that are so clearly coming from Hindutva forces, my response is not immediately to lash out and to say, this is such garbage or what have you, but to try to accept the terms in which they are articulating it, because so much of this is affective, right? It's about emotions. And you can't present rational arguments when people feel that they are taking up something which means so much to them personally. And so it's very tricky, and it is, in the end, a challenging sort of set of arguments to have. But I don't know, I guess what guides my activism is to always approach people with compassion and to listen, to really listen to what people are saying before preaching at them or before sharing, some of the things that those of us who are academics and who have the time to read and to learn and to, write about can actually be shared with them.
All right, we're coming to the end of the hour. So I'm just going to read out the last question, which is also a comment. How do the Islamophobes amongst the American elites maintain their advocacy of the colonization of Muslim majority countries while maintaining a close relationship with Saudi Arabia? So there, if you want to, talk about these contradictions, and then we can end with that.
Right. Well, let me say something about this anonymous attendee who says something about being called a dot head and a cow worshipper. Absolutely. I believe that has existed, dot busting or what have you. I'm not saying that there aren't people who may have antipathy and animosity towards Hinduism as a religion and the physical sort of manifestations of that through the bindi, the botu, and what have you. But that is not the basis on which, for the most part, that people who adhere to Hinduism face discrimination. If anything, it's because they look Muslim. If anything, it's because they are brown-skinned. And it's that which structures the racism and discrimination that they face. So how do the elites maintain their advocacy? Well, let's just out here, 20 years since 9/11, 15 of the 19 hijackers were of Saudi origin, right? Let us not forget that. But was the US ready to go to war with Saudi Arabia? Absolutely not. Saudi Arabia has been known as the prize in the United States, at least since the 1930s, when the first oil wells were discovered. The US has had a special relationship with Saudi Arabia based on the notion of oil for security, right? Which is give us access to cheap oil and let us control the world oil market, and we will give you security. And what security actually means, of course, is security from dissident movements in Saudi Arabia. So workers' movements, women's movements, these are all things that the CIA, through Aramco, has actually worked to squash in order to keep Saudi Arabia in the kind of state that it is, as an authoritarian, monarchical regime, which is probably the most repressive in terms of women's rights and human rights and so forth. So how does the US maintain a close relationship? Well, because there are often, sort of public denunciations of Saudi Arabia and its policies and this and that. Although Trump took it a step further, right? When the journalist Khashoggi was killed, and it's quite clearly, orchestrated from above, Prince Salman and so on, he was, perfectly fine with that. Most US presidents are not. And there's the routine sort of denunciation of, this is bad or that is bad or what have you, but never an occupation or an invasion. So the thing about imperialism, colonialism, racism is that the discourse around this is not stable. It's constantly shifting. It constantly changes because it's a strategic posture, right? Empire is not a cemented structure. Empires must constantly change strategy, not least because people resist what they're trying to do around the world. And they must also try to convince their own citizenry of the righteousness of what it is that they're doing. And people domestically also resist. And so there are constantly shifting ways in which racism is articulated and colonialism and imperialism is justified. I'll just give you a recent example. I've been watching some of the media coverage around the US defeat, really, in Afghanistan. And on the one hand, you have the same nauseating images as you saw back in 2001, which is US soldiers handing out bottles of water, carrying babies and handing them over to medics and so on, the white man's burden, we're here to save you kind of thing. On the other hand, for the first time, we're actually seeing Afghan women in the city centers protesting. So here was a story for the last 20 years, which denied Afghan women agency, the fact that they are actually capable of standing up and fighting for their own rights, which is, if you know anything about the history of Rawa, you would know that, Afghanistan has a robust group of women who've been standing up for women's rights for decades and so on. So it's very contradictory. On the one hand, there was the suppression of Afghan women's agency and this sort of ubiquitous image of women in the blue burqa. in 2001, and now suddenly they're agents without the burqa protesting and so forth. So things do shift and change, but in the end, it's about, you know, how do you convince enough of the population that your you know, your aims are righteous, and that's a shifting target, and you know, as a result, it produces different narratives and different logics.
Right. So I don't know if you want to take this one last question and then we can end.
Sure.
So the question is, what's the responsibility of Islamic nations to get rid of the image? Given that India has a huge migrant population in the Gulf, can there be any intervention that's less political and more of an outreach program? Or will the politics keep them from antagonizing India when it comes to Islam? India always has smartly called many issues as internal matter to get away from criticism in the international forum.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, it's not something I can take up in 1 or 2 minutes, but I'll do my best. So Edward Said, who I drew on very heavily, both in the first edition and second edition of the book, basically calls Muslim majority nations out, particularly those in the Middle East and North Africa. By the way, I use the word Muslim majority nations because we don't want to invisibilize religious minorities in these regions, right? There are Christian Arabs, there are Druze, you know, and so forth. So Said takes them to task and says, you have a responsibility to actually push back against the kind of racist, although he didn't use the word racist, the Orientalist images that come from Europe and from the United States. And his critique basically was along the lines that because so many of these nations are dictatorial regimes that rely on aid from the West, that rely on military aid as well as weapons and so on, and that are backed and propped to the hilt in terms of, you know, various policies, particularly neoliberal policies over the last few decades, that they don't want to antagonize the, you know, you don't slap the hand that feeds you, right? You don't bite the hand that feeds you, what have you. And so at this state level, in fact, what you've seen, and this is not my area of scholarship, what you've seen is a, you know, an acceptance of anti-Muslim racism, an acceptance of Orientalism and Islamophobia. So the UAE, for instance, this is an example from some years ago, had a female pilot who took part in, you know, some bombings in Iraq, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. And that was, you know, touted as, look how liberated we are, right? It's in line with the imperial feminist argument. So far from at the state level, you know, pushing back against the racist and imperial feminist narratives, some of these nation states have actually amplified them, echoed and amplified them. But at the bottom, at the level of people and in terms of the Indian diaspora in these countries, I mean, I agree with you that, you know, organizing among this community and education and so forth is a great idea. But at the same time, as I just mentioned earlier, you know, one of the roles that the US has played in the region is to make sure that protest movements that offer a different narrative, that offer different views of how they think their nations should be structured, have always been resisted. So when the Arab Spring, right, the Arab revolutions of 2011 began, it was, you know, represented by Orientalists in standard sort of, you know, racist terms, which is that these people are not ready for Western style democracy. That's what Bernard Lewis had to say about it. And I mean, Obama, you know, at first, actually, in the case of Egypt, doesn't take a stand, wants to make sure that, his allies stay in power. But when the winds start to change and there's just massive support around the world for the Egyptian revolution, including in the US, for instance, in Madison, Wisconsin, people are carrying picket signs saying, "Fight like an Egyptian," right? You know the song, "Walk Like an Egyptian." And they were fighting against their governor, and they were tying their two struggles through in terms of a neoliberal system that systematically, disenfranchises and doesn't work in the interests of the vast majority of people, right? It benefits only the 1%. And so those sorts of solidarities, I think, are possible. We saw them in 2011, 2012, where movements in squares in Spain, in Egypt, and elsewhere were all consciously acknowledging one another and imitating one another's tactics. So I guess I'll end by reading just the last part of my book, if you'll indulge me now. At the end of the day, the vast majority of people around the world are forced to live under a profoundly unjust and unequal system. Mass revolts in 2011 showed that this system and its warped priorities will not go unchallenged. The uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt spread not only to other countries in the region, but also to Europe and the United States. Protesters learned strategy and tactics from one another as public spaces became key focal points for the movements, from Tahrir Square in Egypt to Pearl Square in Bahrain, Puerta del Sol in Madrid, Syntagma Square in Athens, and Zuccotti Park in New York City. Protest movements self-consciously honored one another through solidarity greetings and the imitation of tactics. In Madison, Wisconsin, the fight against Republican Governor Scott Walker was seen as similar to that of the Egyptians against Hosni Mubarak. Despite local differences, all of the movements were directed against the neoliberal regime of the 1% and were both political and economic struggles. Instead of feeling pity for their Arab and Muslim brothers and sisters, right, which is what the white man's burden is about, is to see them as inferior, activists in the West took inspiration from the successes of their counterparts in Tunisia, Egypt, and Iran. In place of the white man's burden, a politics of international solidarity became more visible. To be sure, such international solidarity has existed in decades prior to the 2010s. The national liberation struggles that swept the world from India to Algeria in the post-war period, post-Second World War, rattled the centers of imperialism, even as struggles were beginning to emerge inside Europe and the United States. By the 1960s, radical social movements in countries around the world rose up against capitalism, racism, and imperialism. Today, we are in a similar but also different and new era. This is an era of victories, but also defeats, of highs and lows, of revolutions and counter-revolutions. What is undeniable is the desire for change. What this brings is the potential to create a brand new world free of racism and imperialism, a world where every individual will be treated with respect, a world that will destroy empire and dump anti-Muslim racism into the dustbin of history, and that will be the end of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that powerful end. Thank you for ending on a note of hope and on the side of struggle. I think you've shown us what committed and principled scholarship is like. To our people who are listening in, please read Dr. Kumar's book. And I could not have thought of a better way to start our Missing Lecture series. And as I said in the beginning, I hope these series will be short. So thank you, Deepa, so much. And thank you everyone who attended the talk today.